Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Mr. Ray.
I'd like you to open your Old Testaments to the book of Ruth, a little short book nestled in there between the book of Judges and 1 Samuel. It's great to be back. We had a little different weather last Sunday when I was in Southern California than we're having today. See, the snow's already stopped, so you don't have to worry about that. We had a great time with the church I worked with before I moved here, the church right before I moved here, which was a workshop on marriage and parenting, and a lot of sunshine. We got vitamin D, not from a pill, last weekend, and that was very nice. And we didn't have any smoke, no sign of any smoke down there, so we were very happy. Back in December, I started a series of lessons on the book of Ruth. You may or may not remember that. If you want to hear that first lesson, it's available online. And Ruth is actually set in the time period of the book of Judges. And Ruth was a Moabite woman who finds herself in the genealogy of Jesus, as you can read in the book of Matthew. You'll get it from the end of Ruth because you'll see that she is related to King David, who's also in Jesus' line. In that first sermon, we noticed that the book opens with three deaths: the death of Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion, and then it ends with three births at the end of that book. And so now we're actually going to start making our way through that book. Let me, there we go. Got the right thing there. The text for this morning is pretty long, verses 6 through 22. I'm not going to read it ahead of time because we're going to go through it verse by verse in a few minutes anyway. But basically the story is about two women, Ruth and Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law. It is a story that has a good bit of suffering and helplessness, a story of God's providential care and blessing through that suffering. And listen, at some level, probably all of us have been through some form of suffering in our lives, and hopefully have or will experience the same kind of blessing that will come at the end of that. I do not believe that the book of Ruth is a fable. I don't believe it's an allegory. I think these are real people. It's real history. She is, after all, in the lineage of Jesus and going to be the great-grandmother of King David. Our text this morning is the beginning of that journey, and really it's a journey for Naomi from a state of deep loss to blessing. And Ruth is the vehicle that's going to take these. These women are grappling with difficult circumstances. They're dialoguing with each other about that as they go along. And I think there's just a lot for us to learn as we look at this book and specifically this text. You can just follow along in your Bibles. You can just keep your Bibles open to Ruth 1. Any other texts, which are just going to be a few, I'll have up on the screen. So let me give you a real quick background of what we've already covered. Then again, we looked at that a couple months ago. Famine has come on God's people, and more than likely by God's hand, because of their idolatry, because of their sinfulness. Naomi and her family, Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion, her two sons, fled from Judah and went to the neighboring land of Moab, to a different culture, away from all of their families. And here now they're going to eke out a living there. And while they are there, her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, marry Moabite wives. It's not very long until tragedy strikes and Naomi's husband dies, and then both of her sons die. And she's left alone with just these two daughters-in-law. And that's where we find ourselves as we open the text. So let's begin. We're going to read verse 6. Move my ribbon so I can see the verse numbers. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. And so God has come to the aid of his people. Whatever punishment has ended, the famine is over. And so she decides to go back to her native land. Listen, this is a patriarchal society. And if she needs or wants or deserves support, it's only going to come from her family. So she needs to go back to where that can be found. Verse 7, it says, with her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. And so the 2 daughters-in-law, I'm trying to keep up with myself here. Apparently preparing, they go with her. They're all packed up, they're on their way. They all set out together. And then we come to verses 8 through 10, and we'll just read those one verse at a time. In verse 8, Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, go back, each of you to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. And so as they're on their way, Naomi says, listen, Ruth and Orpah, you need to go back. You need to go back to your mother's homes, which is a little bit unusual phraseology for us. Usually it's stated you go back to your father's home. But she says to your mother's home. And I think that the reason that Naomi used that term is that she's trying to disassociate herself from them of looking on her as their mother. You go back to your real mother. You go back to your birth mothers, your birth homes, your native homes. And she gives her blessing as she really truly hopes that they will leave and that the Lord will show you kindness and show you the kind of kindness that you showed to my sons, the kind of kindness you've shown to me all along. She doesn't want them to feel obligated to have to go with her out of some sort of cultural loyalty. They're free to return. Verse 9 says, may the Lord grant that each of you find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud. So she hopes that they will find new husbands. This is a prayer for their future security. Again, new homes, new husbands, children for their old age. That was the social security of that ancient culture, was your children. Your children would take care of you. And then her further wish here is after giving them that and hoping that their chances for life and security and happiness is going to lie here in their native Moab, rather than as immigrants with her back to her land in Israel. Basically, she's saying the interreligious, the intercultural, the interethnic experiment that we've been running here has to come to an end. And so Naomi kissed them goodbye. And they wept aloud. And verse 10 says, they said to her, we will go back with you to your people. So Naomi's suggestion to leave, they are saying no, we're staying with you. They're not having anything to do with that idea, at least initially. Now we're going to just read a chunk here in verses 11 down through the first part of verse 13. But Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? And so she is trying to make some logical explanations for why they should go. And I do not believe that she's trying to push them away from her in the main sense. She's wanting what's best for them. She honestly and in a very caring way is encouraging them to do what she believes is going to be best for their future. And it's couched in this 3-time repeated phrase, though we haven't seen it the 3rd time yet, which is, my daughters. Return home, my daughters. She very much loves them. And then she, of course, quizzes them, asks them a series of questions that are meant to encourage them to return home. The first one is which? Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who would become your husbands? That would be what would normally occur, at least in the culture of Israel. The Levirate law would kick in, and if this older brother didn't have children, then the younger brother would marry the widow, and the first child would then gain the older brother's inheritance, and that would continue. But Naomi's claim, I don't have any other sons. I don't have any other sons, and not only that, I don't have a husband. And in fact, she said, I'm too old to have another husband. Even if she thought there was hope for that, and listen, I don't think she thinks I'm going to go home and find a man. That's not in her plans. She's too old. That's not in the picture. But even now is this completely unlikely scenario. If I got married tonight, and if I gave birth to sons, which in this congregation it's always girls that have been born lately, and so you'd have to factor that in, having sons. Well, you've had 4 girls. I'm sitting here waiting for you to finally have a son. But she said, if I got married tonight and had sons right away, would you wait for them to grow up? Would you stay unmarried until they were of marriageable age? And the answer to that, of course, is no, that's not reasonable. So this long goodbye is coming to an end. Naomi's arguments are complete. And listen, here in the midst of this goodbye, we are going to be given an insight into Naomi's heart. In verse 13, the latter part of the verse, she says, no, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Listen, that kind of a conclusion, that when you've had all of these bad things happen, and I'm not at all minimizing what happened to Naomi. She lost her husband, and then she lost both of her sons. But it doesn't even have to be that bad. For many people, when that happens, what Naomi's opinion here isn't unique to her, because a lot of people will say, God's hand is against me. Now, before she was recounting events in her life, this is what happened, and here's what could happen, and et cetera, et cetera. What she's doing now is giving us her interpretation of what has happened to her. So she's moved from facts to poetry. She's moved from history to philosophy, and she has moved from the suffering that she has endured to her statement of God's role in that suffering. I think, and I have not paid enough attention to this as I've looked at Ruth before, all 3 of these women have suffered loss. They've all suffered the loss of a husband. Naomi says here, it's more bitter for me than you. And it is more bitter. And she states the reason why here. And by the way, that word bitter in the Hebrew is the word mara, M-A-R-A. Just tuck that back in your brain there for a second. She is more bitter. She didn't just lose a husband. She also lost both of her sons. So it's certainly more bitter. And her conclusion to that is that the Lord's hand is against me. And listen, when tragedy strikes in a family, in somebody's life, like when a very young life has ended. I told you a few weeks ago I did a funeral for a 5-year-old girl. When there's a miscarriage, when there's a death at the end of after a pregnancy, or when somebody is diagnosed and it's discovered they have some sort of horrendous, fatal disease, or they suffer a staggering financial loss or emotional loss. People will ask, what kind of God allows this to happen? I came across a quote this last week that it's the opposite. It's, here we are as believers in God, and why are you letting this happen? The other side of this, and it just struck me, and maybe this isn't the place to put it, but I wanted to share it with you, and this was the best place I could come up with. The worst moment for an atheist is when he's really thankful and has no one to thank. And here we are on this side where we believe in God and we're saying, why are you letting this happen? And we cry out to the God we believe in, and we ask a very simple question, why? And the worst scenario of that is what we see in Naomi here, and that is that we blame God for the difficulty that we're having. And I want you to notice, back behind myself again, that every part, and I'm only going to give you 3, but every part of Naomi is affected by this conclusion that she's come to. Theologically, she sees herself as cursed by God. That's just what she sees, that God has cursed me. Psychologically, she is trying to hide her pain, to hide her loss by sending these 2 women away. Because listen, when she looks at her daughters-in-law, she sees her sons. She sees the hope that she had for grandchildren, and they're not there. They're not going to be there. And so she wants to bury that pain. She wants to bury that loss. And the problem is that the pain and loss is alive. And it will come back up at some point in time. You can't just bury that. And relationally, she's trying to distance herself from the very ones who love her and can help her. And those are just pretty classic symptoms of someone who's suffering great pain, of pushing other people away and pushing away the very people that can help you. And again, I do not want to minimize. Naomi has endured an unthinkable amount of grief here, and the weight of that grief is now being given voice to in what we just read. And so she's having problems holding the grief in one hand and holding on to the hope, or any hope, in the other. And so she's given up the hope because she views herself as cursed. And because she views herself as cursed, she sees herself as a dead end for Orpah and Ruth. There's no hope for them with her. That's her rationale. Now we know, because we've read the rest of the story, that she's incorrect in her view. And listen, I want you, if you find yourself in a similar situation of grief and loss that Naomi is in, that you'll remember that that wasn't the end of the story for Ruth and Naomi. Verse 14. At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. So again, there's a lot of weeping. There's going to be a separation that's going to finally occur, because listen, Orpah is convinced by Naomi's logic, by her argumentation. And so she leaves, and she's going to leave the story. And Robin and I were talking about this, and she said a lot of times when she's had this study, and there's in women's studies and stuff, everybody says, "Oh, Orpah," shake their hand at Orpah. Why would you do that? She did that because she thought that was best. She did that because the mother-in-law that she loved convinced her it was best. And she saw no hope going with Naomi. And she wanted a home. She wanted children. People do that when they take the short view, when they just see this far. And listen, we recognize she missed out on the redemption that God could possibly have had for her, which he's going to give to Naomi and going to give to Ruth. And I guess what I want us to understand is not everyone weaves themselves into God's story because of the fact of our own actions, our own decisions. You all have a place in God's story. You all have a place in his will, but you have to act. And you have to make the decisions to place yourself there. And that's kind of a subtle message here with regards to Orpah, but I think it deserves being aired and us to be considerate. The last thing, though, that we read is that Ruth clung to Naomi. The word clung is dabak in Hebrew. It's D-A-B-A-Q. It is exactly the same word that we read right here in Genesis, the 2nd chapter, in verse 24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast, cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That's part of God's plan for marriage and what he intended for that. And in this action, in clinging to Naomi, Ruth is telling her, I'm not going anywhere. I am staying with you. Let's look at verses 15 through 18. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So Naomi starts off by saying, look at your sister, look at Orpah, follow her example. She's made the right choice. She's doing the right thing. And Ruth responds, don't urge me to leave you. Don't urge me to turn back from you. And then there's that beautiful oath of loyalty that Ruth gives to Naomi that is still read today in weddings. Of faithfulness and of loyalty and of clinging to one another. And what I want you again to remember here is that Ruth is suffering too. She lost her husband too. She is alone too. And it's really easy for us to forget that. I mean, it's way back in verses 4 and 5 that we are told that she lost Mahlon. The reason I'm bringing that up, and by the way, you won't see that she's married to Mahlon until you get over to chapter 4. Okay, so I just share all of you that are hunting for Mahlon there. It's later on, stay with me. Okay? What I want you to notice is the difference here between Ruth and Naomi. I want you to see that they both are suffering generally the same pain. But I want you to see how Ruth handles it differently than Naomi does. Instead of viewing herself as cursed by God, as Naomi did, she is embracing God. She's embracing the God she learned from Naomi. That's how she found out about him. Maybe her husband, her father-in-law. And so she will not abandon this God and go back to her gods, back to her home. Ruth is the embodiment of Matthew 22, 37 through 39. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second like it, love your neighbor as yourself." That's exactly what Ruth is doing. And listen, you can't separate those two. You can't say you love God and hate your neighbor. You can't hate your neighbor and say you love God. Ruth is saying, I love your God and I love you. And I'm going to live that out. In fact, in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 17, John wrote, "If anyone has material blessings and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person?" The love of God is in Ruth. Her mother-in-law is in need. And she is not going to abandon her. So Ruth moves toward her. She is not going to be, I keep going on and I don't want to. Whereas Naomi was bearing her pain, Ruth is not bearing her pain. Listen, leaving Naomi and going with Orpah would be the easier thing to do. In fact, it might be even enticing. Naomi now becomes the embodiment or enfleshment of Ruth's pain. Naomi is the reminder of Ruth of her dead husband, Mahlon. Every time Ruth looks at Naomi, she sees Mahlon. I have some mannerisms that I guess were trained into me as a child of my mother's. Robin points them out to me every once in a while. That's just like what your mom would do. What Ruth sees Naomi doing, I remember, that's where Mahlon got that. Oh, that's where that laugh, that voice, everything about Naomi, she sees Mahlon. And she's reminded of that. She hears his voice. Yet she moves toward Naomi in her suffering, not trying to bury that like Naomi did. And finally, looking at it relationally, she wants a relationship with Naomi. She's not sending her away. In fact, when we part from people, sometimes we'll say, keep in touch. We see them every once in a while or check in on with them occasionally. Ruth said, where you're going, I'm going. Where you stay, that's where I'm staying. Your God and your people, they're going to be my God and my people. In fact, where you die, that's where I'm going to die and be buried. This isn't just a keep in touch kind of a thing, or let's try to stay close. No, Ruth is in Naomi's back pocket. She truly clings to her. And so when we look at Naomi and we look at Ruth, we see two different reactions to the same pain. And we're going to get to see what God can do with that pain. And Ruth is the one now who's leading Naomi to a redemption that she had no hope for. But that part of the story is a ways off. And as we just read in verse 18, you can see that when Naomi saw that Ruth is not going, she quit urging her. Listen, that's a good rule of thumb for marriages too. Yeah. You tell your spouse, say, I'm not going anywhere. And you say, shouldn't we get a divorce? I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here. Quit urging me to do that because I'm not going anywhere. It's a good point. Let's finish the text down through verse 22. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived at Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And so they arrive. Oh, am I that far behind? See, I got done preaching and I forgot to do this. So they arrive in Bethlehem. It's been 10 years. It's been 10 years since they left. And she left Bethlehem with a husband and 2 unmarried sons, and now she comes back a widow and with no sons and just 1 Moabite daughter-in-law. And I was assuming that Naomi was born and raised here in this town. And of course, her return has created quite a stir. This is just a small village. Everybody's gonna know about this. And so the women gather around her. And they can't believe it. Is this Naomi? Are you Naomi? And she says, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara." That's that word that I highlighted for you back in verse 13. Listen, Naomi means delight. It means pleasantness. Mara means bitter. There's 2 things here that Naomi does in association with the conclusion that she's drawn about her life and the misfortune that she's having here. And the first thing she does is she renames herself. In the Bible, your name was your identity. It's not like that mostly today. Sometimes we'll choose a name because we like the meaning of it. But most of the time, I think parents choose a name because they like the way the syllables sound when they're put together. Okay? It's kind of pleasant. Or maybe you're going to name them because of, in honor of an ancestor or a close friend or something like that. In Bible times, it was your destiny. I mean, you were given a name, and so here's your goal. Be for Naomi, be pleasant, be gentle. And so it became a goal and became your destiny and your identity. And for Naomi, that doesn't fit anymore. She's not pleasant. She's not gentle. She's bitter. And why does she feel that way? She feels that way because she's blaming God for her misfortune. 4 times. The Almighty has made my life bitter, brought me back empty, has afflicted me, brought misfortune on me. This is her conclusion, and she repeats it 4 times. It's a deep-rooted conclusion that she has. God's getting the blame for everything here. And that's causing her to redefine who she is. It's causing her to map out the future that she sees for herself. And in fact, it colors who she believes God is. And so the story for us here ends with them arriving in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So let me give you a quick overview here. We have 3 women. We have Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. All of them suffering truly a unique pain. I'm not saying it's the same. Listen, when you lose your spouse and someone comes up to you and says, "I know what you're feeling," you can just say, "No, you don't." Because your relationship with your spouse was different than my relationship with my spouse. We loved each other. I had more love for her than you'll ever have for anybody. I mean, that's what's going through the person's mind. You can't say, "I know what you're feeling." No, you don't. And so I know that while they all lost their husbands, it was different for each one of them, but there's still some amazing similarities here that we can't ignore. All 3 have been widowed in a patriarchal culture, and in that was a destiny of poverty. That's where you found yourself. All 3 are childless. And that not only meant for a woman especially a widow, that she has no social security. She has no security when she's old. In this day and time, there's also a dishonor. I mean, no children? What did you do that God has not given you children? I mean, there was a true dishonor about that. And so we have Orpah, who stays and is now out of the story. We have Naomi, who is absolutely sunk in the darkest, deepest despair possible. And we have Ruth standing, hoping against hope. It's like Abraham in Romans, the 4th chapter, in verse 18. There's nothing out there that appears to be out there positive for me. And there she is standing, radiating hope. And so we ask, well, how did that happen with Ruth? Which is what makes this story so amazing. And she becomes a model for us to adopt in our grief. Here's what Jesus said in John 16:33. I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. You say, well, how do you know that, Jesus? Well, because... Listen, that choice was made back in Eden. It was made by human beings when they chose to believe a lie rather than to accept God's truth. I mean, there they were in Eden. They had everything they wanted or could want, and pleasant, and everything was good. And they believed the lie, and this is the world we inherited from them. And so in this world, you will have trouble. And in our story, it's trouble like famine. It's troubles like sorrow. It's troubles like death, loss, helplessness, and hopelessness. And that sounds really bad. And then you read the rest of what Jesus said in the latter part of that verse. But take heart. I've overcome the world. That doesn't mean we won't suffer. What that means is that Jesus makes suffering here sufferable. We can get through it. And the reason we can get through it, and the reason he gives us hope, is because he's overcome the world. And he has a better plan for us. I love this psalm. Psalm 126 and verse 5. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. And you will sow with tears. I promise you, if you haven't yet, you will. But because Jesus has overcome the world, you will reap, and you will reap songs of joy. So Ruth is the story basically of Naomi's redemption. And we hear it, oddly enough, it's almost like you have a Greek chorus in Ruth. And the Greek chorus are the women of the village. And they meet and say, is this really Naomi? And they're going to sound off again here in the 4th chapter. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women, here they come again, said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. May his name be renowned in Israel. That was not something Naomi ever thought she was going to hear. And she wasn't going to hear it as Mara. And then later on in verses 15 through 17, he shall be to you a restorer of life. Same women here. And a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So here was Naomi, a childless widow in the depth of sorrow and grief, and now she is surrounded by family. She is blessed with offspring, even though it's once removed. And where she thought God was the perpetrator of her grief and sorrow, she ultimately did not push him away, and God blessed her. And I'll just close with the statement, God wants to bless you too. He wants to walk with you in your sorrow and your grief, in your loss. And he has this absolutely wonderful invitation at the mouth of Jesus, which is, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest to your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. We're about to sing a song entitled An Empty Mansion. It's based on the King James Version, where Jesus said in John, I'm going away to prepare a place for you. In my Father's house are many mansions. The word is probably better translated rooms, but we can't sing rooms here instead of mansions. I just want you to understand that. We're not going there to get rich. We're going there to be in the presence of God. And when Jesus said, I'm going to prepare a place for you, you better believe it. There's a place for you. But you have to, like Ruth, instead of Orpah, you have to choose. You have to make that choice. And if we can help you with your relationship with the Lord this morning, please come forward while we stand and sing.
Here I lay